Hello and welcome to NewsClick, this program with the real news. An international trade tribunal at The Hague has imposed a penalty on India. This penalty comes out of a lawsuit between Devas, a company from Mauritius, and Antrix, the commercial arm of Indian space research organization ISRO, an organization owned by the government of India. To talk about this strange event that encompasses space research through international treaties, through trade tribunals, we have with us Prabir Purkayastha. Prabir, what are the details of this deal? What were the terms of the contract?
The deal was between Antrix and Devas, which was for essentially 70 megahertz of spectrum in the S-band, which ISRO occupied or was given the spectrum by the government of India. And this deal was reached between Antrix, the commercial arm of ISRO, and Devas, supposedly for broadband multimedia usage. So this was done in 2005. We didn't really know much about it. In fact, there was hardly any publicity on that. And subsequently, in 2011, it became clear that this involved a huge transfer, essentially, of the S-band spectrum to Devas as a consequence of this deal. And by that time, we were much clearer about what the spectrum is and what it means in commercial terms. So the question was, did ISRO or Antrix have the right to transfer something which was given to it for space purposes into such commercial usage? Did this right belong to ISRO at all? And was this done without really following the various procedures that should have been followed in such a case?
And why did it not go through?
It was a grossly undervalued spectrum that was sold, because all that Antrix was going to get was $300 million, essentially spread over 12 years. And if we take what it was going to spend, it was going to spend almost a similar amount, because you have to consider future earnings as really discounted earnings. So if you take the amount that ISRO was supposed to spend on the launches, of which 90% of the transponders would be occupied by Devas alone. So this was really commercially a deal that really didn't make much sense. In fact, there was a lot of outcry over it. CAG had a very strong report against this deal, and at that point of time, 2 committees went into it and found various procedural lapses.
Why international trade treaties? Where do bilateral international treaties come into picture in space research?
In this particular case, this is a consequence of the bilateral treaty agreements that India has. We have now bilateral treaty agreements with 80-odd countries, 83 countries probably. And these bilateral treaties have very stringent provisions for protection of the investors, which means that the investors can take India to court on policies, and those policies could be even, say, banks being forced to open rural branches or to give credits to certain core sector lendings as banks in India do. All of this, if you privatize these banks or you disinvest some of the shares of the banks, the shareholders under bilateral treaties can then sue you abroad. This is what has happened to Coal India. This is what has also happened to India on, for instance, all these telecom cases, because the telecom license is being cancelled, and also Vodafone suing India for retrospective imposition of certain taxes.
Antrix is a commercial company, and so is Devas. Why would Devas sue India at an international court? How does international bilateral treaties come into picture between 2 commercials?
Now, why did India get into such bilateral treaties itself is another question, and that's basically trying to reach what are called free trade agreements or looking for investments from abroad. So under liberalization, the argument was we need foreign capital. For foreign capital, we need to give some incentives to foreign capital. Therefore, we need to make certain conditions with such foreign capital, which is a bilateral investment treaty. That's really the form it finally takes. That investment treaties which allows certain settled conditions for the investors. Now, most of these bilateral investment treaties then have clauses which appear rather innocuous. You don't really, when you read these clauses, you don't understand the implications of it. Implications of this are that under this bilateral investment treaties, India can be sued in a foreign jurisdiction, and essentially then that whether India has expropriated the interests of other companies or not will not be left to the courts in India, but will be left to what are essentially commercial arbitration procedures, which are heavily weighed against global South countries. Now, this has been the experience of all global South companies who have really signed these treaties, I would say, in blissful ignorance, without understanding what it entails. Until some of these cases came up, they didn't even know what it entailed till they were sued, essentially. And Argentina, for instance, in 1998 to 2002 got into a very serious crisis. They have now 56 suits against them, again in various tribunals, again all arguing for expropriation of interests of foreign capital. And essentially these were internal policy measures that Argentina was forced to take. So Devas investors, there was an investment company called Devas in Mauritius, which has invested in Devas, which is a so-called Indian company. And they are the ones, as investors, protecting their investment in India under the bilateral investment treaty with Mauritius that has taken the Indian government to court, saying that by virtue of your decision, you have essentially expropriated our investments in India. And that's also because of the nature of the cancellation. The cancellation essentially was by India or the Indian government saying that the spectrum, the S-band spectrum, is not meant for commercial use. So therefore, they did not allow ISRO and Antrix to sell the spectrum, though it was already committed through the Antrix Devas agreement. So that led to Antrix saying this is a force majeure case beyond our control, and therefore we cannot do anything about it, we have to cancel the contract. So this should have been a relatively easier course if instead of using this, shall we say, hammer as a weapon, if we had, for instance, had a commercial dispute with Devas, because Devas had not fulfilled many of its contractual deliveries. It was supposed to deliver a certain set of things, it had not done so. So it could have been cancelled if we had looked at all of these and not understood that if we go the route that we finally did, that would open us to various commercial litigation, which is what has happened.
But that brings up an important question that you write about in your article, which is that there is an industry of lawyers that has cropped up that basically are in the business of suing governments.
Yes, this is a new industry. As the West's, shall we say, industrial prowess decreases, its legal and financial prowess seems to be increasing. And one of the consequences of this is this whole new industry that has sprung up, which is international lawyers suing sovereign governments in various courts. Most of them are investors in the US or other investors located in Europe. Their investment rooted, a lot of them through Netherlands, which seems to be the most, shall we say, favorable to the investors, and also Holland's bilateral treaties seem to also be most favorable to the investors. So a lot of them are being sued in this form. So it's a new industry of lawyers who have come up. The other part which is also very disturbing is the number of arbitrators who are dealing with all these cases are very, very few. And they all seem to be also part of companies who also do the suing. So there is a revolving door here. A partner of a company is an arbitrator, and the company may be involved on the investor side in another case.
And there's another revolving door involved here. What is Devas? I mean, where does Devas come from?
Well, Devas is a company whose investors are really not very transparent, because once you come to the Mauritius route, we do not know who the original investors are, because you have a sort of shadow board which has some figureheads which supposedly are Devas, but they're really not the original investors. So whether it's black money, whether it's other monies, we really don't know who Devas is.
In terms of next steps, Prabir, what can a country in the global south like India, what should India's policies outlook be towards bilateral treaties in the context of this climate of suing and very disadvantageous treaties?
Well, I think the government of India has realized this now. We have been saying this for the last 15 years. Please look at the bilateral investment treaties. all this trade talks of liberalizing trade globally, investment being treated as trade, WTO getting into protection of capital flows, all this we have been saying is please understand what it does is takes away your ability to control your own economy. So they are essentially continuation of neocolonial policies. Now, the two things that the government of India has to do. One is, of course, ask for a revision of all the treaties or walk out of them. Now, that's an easy way. But unfortunately, some of these treaties have a sunset clause, and even if you walk out of them, for things you have done, you could be liable for next 15 years. So there is, unfortunately, a longevity of the treaties, even if you walk out of them. But we need to renegotiate, because India has economic clout. It needs to renegotiate and modify these treaties or cancel them as it can. Okay, so whichever ones it should cancel, it can cancel, it should cancel or modify under this threat. On the other side of it, I think India has a much bigger role to play, which is internationally look at the regime of such treaties and what is being done in terms of commercial disputes with countries. And I think a huge number of countries are at risk, because what's happening is increasingly the global system of judgments, either the courts in the US courts have actually allowed compensation against Argentina. It has allowed compensation against Iran on cases which have nothing to do with a basic trade dispute. So you have to look at these kinds of issues, that a global regime, international law regime which is fair to the global south has to be built, and I think India should take this up. It relates to taxation, it relates to tax havens, it relates to a whole number of issues in which we see a continuation of neocolonial policies under now legal garb. And let's not forget, a lot of the countries lost their independence according to treaties which are one-sided and then was used later on to take away their independence.
In terms of this specific case, what can be the next steps?
Well, I think we have really got ourselves into a huge jam, partly because the steps we take now will appear retrospective as a means to address what as a mistake that had been done earlier. So it may not look very good if at the moment we try to do various things. One of the things which India has fortunately done is that it did take up violations of law that Devas had. So the Enforcement Directorate had cases that it had looked for, given them notices for violations of FEMA. So there are legal violations that one can look at for which Devas can be pulled up, including the fact that it had made certain promises in front of when it applied for the Foreign Investment Promotion Board. So some of those clauses of the provisions under which they had got the clearances have also, it appears, been violated. So we can take them up there. We can also take up these cases, because finally the implementation of this has to be done in India. We can take up this in the Indian courts, which already we have. So those are some of the legal steps we can take. But the danger here is that the UN Central procedures, which India is a party to, it has signed these treaties, are rather onerous, and it can mean that Indian government's properties abroad can be attached if such courts then in those countries these companies apply for move against the Indian government.
That's all we have time for today. Keep watching NewsClick for more.